This is the final week of Jesus' life, of Jesus' earthly life. And the situation between him and the religious leaders is getting quite intense. The leaders are trying to kill him, trying to find a way to kill him, but they can't because of all the crowds that are there. Why are all the crowds there? The crowds are there because it's Passover time, and Jews from all over the world have flocked to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is packed full of pilgrims who have gone for the Passover. And because you have all these extra people from all around the world that have gone to Jerusalem, you know, when you have people who leave home and you got big crowds somewhere else, people tend to get a bit more excitable, shall we say. And so Rome has sent a bunch of more soldiers there. You got a bunch of soldiers in Jerusalem trying to make sure that no one does anything tricky. And so this whole scene is very delicate. You got Jesus, you got the religious leaders who are trying to kill him, you got crowds everywhere, you got Romans everywhere. It's very explosive. And we've seen Jesus go into Jerusalem on the donkey, people praising him, Hosanna to the Son of David. We've seen him cleanse the temple. And then we saw that the religious authorities came to him and they said, by what authority do you think that you're doing these things? And then last week we saw how Jesus told a parable which basically had to do with, which ended basically with the destruction and punishment of the Jewish leaders. And so if you look at the last verse from last week, it's verse 19, Luke chapter 20, verse 19, we ended with this. It said, "And the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them." So they want to kill him, but they can't because of all the crowds. Which leads to our text starting in verse 20. I'll read the entire text and then we'll take it verse by verse. Luke 20:20. "So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. Then they asked him, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?' But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, 'Why do you test me? Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have?' They answered and said, 'Caesar's.' And he said to them, 'Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent." Very famous passage. Now, quick story from the Old Testament. Do you remember Balaam in the Old Testament? The book of Numbers, the Jews have spent 40 years in the wilderness, and they have stopped in the plains of Moab just beyond the Jordan, and they're ready to pass the Jordan and go into the land. And as they're in Moab, the king of Moab is kind of nervous, and so he hires a man named Balaam to come and curse them. And Balaam, it's a long story, but Balaam basically says, okay, we'll see what we can do. Goes up on the mountain, sees the entire camp of Israel there, and he opens his mouth to try and curse the Jews. But God is so in control of the entire situation that Balaam starts speaking blessings instead of curses. The king of Moab is, "Oh no, what are you doing to me?" And they try again and again. As soon as he opens his mouth, he only speaks blessings instead of curses. He's trying to curse Israel, but it won't work. And so they go down the mountain. That didn't work. So Balaam then has another idea. He says, okay, going straight forward into it and trying to curse them doesn't work. So let's try something else. Let's try and be a bit more subtle. And so what does he do? He says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to send a bunch of beautiful women over into the camp of the Jews. And we'll try and seduce them. Try and take them away. And surely enough, beautiful women go down there. The Jewish men see them. They look pretty nice. Follow along with them. Do whatever it is that they're going to do. And then the women are like, hey, how about we go and sacrifice to Baal? I got to go to the temple today. Will you come and sacrifice with me? And the guys were like, sure, baby, whatever you want. I'm with you. And so the children of Israel fall into great sin by following these women. What's my point? My point is that this is how Satan works. Satan has two ways of attacking. He can either attack you straightforward, boom, or he can try subtly on the side. You see, he knows, he could come and say, hey everyone, stop believing in Jesus, stop believing in God, worship Satan. But he knows that's probably not going to work too well. So what he does is, he tries to attack you subtly, on the side. He'll give you lies, but maybe mix it with a bit of truth to confuse you. And you'll be like, oh, sounds pretty good. I'm not quite sure. Sure, let's go with that. And he'll get you to sin that way. Well, these religious leaders that we have in our passage today, same people who Jesus called sons of children of the devil earlier on, are now, they want to kill Jesus. They would love to be able to just walk up to him with a bunch of guards, grab him, yank him out, and stone him. They would love to do that, but they can't because they're afraid of the crowd. So they're like, we got to try a different way. We've got to try a subtle way, so maybe he won't figure out what we're trying to do. Well, what do? Verse 20 says, so they watched them and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. They're like, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and trick him. We're going to pretend that we're righteous. We're going to pretend that we're something that we're not. We're going to ask a good theological question, and hopefully Jesus won't see what we're trying to do, and he'll say something that he shouldn't, and then we can grab him and give him to the governor. That's the idea. Now, real quick, who are these people? Luke doesn't tell us who they were specifically. In Mark, we are told that it's two groups of people, Pharisees and Herodians. You're like, okay, we know who the Pharisees are. We've been seeing them from the beginning. Who are the Herodians? The Herodians were a political group, basically. They were in favor of the Herods, the Herodian family, and which was, of course, in favor of Rome. And this is an amazing thing if you think about it. You have two groups that ordinarily hate each other. Hate each other. The Pharisees are a conservative religious group. The Herodians are a liberal political group. The Pharisees want to get rid of the yoke of Rome. The Herodians are like, oh sure, we love Rome, no problem belonging to Rome. And yet, even though these people kill each other on a daily basis, they're willing to get together as long as we can kill Jesus. I guess it's, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So it doesn't matter if we hate one another. We hate Jesus more so we can join together to try and harm him. So you got these people, these spies, it says, who pretend to be righteous. So they're not righteous, they're pretending to be righteous. They don't mean what they're going to say. They're lying in order to try and trick him. And one thing that I want to point out before we move on, what I find amazing is that the Pharisees, who are among these people who are trying to trick Jesus, the Pharisees, they are a conservative religious group. Do they know the law of God? You bet they know the law of God. Do they know what the 9th commandment is? Do not bear false witness? Of course they do. Sure they do. They know that they're not supposed to lie. They know that God is truth, and therefore they should speak the truth also. Yet, they're willing to lie as long as they can kill Jesus. Doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. We will do evil for the greater good. Well, what they think is the greater good. And the application to us is, do we live according to our confession? Because we say that we're Christians. Do we live according to what Christ said? Do we live according to what the Bible says? Because they said that they believe the Scriptures, but then they don't have a problem going and lying and trying to kill Jesus. Do we live what we confess? We say, yeah, I read something from the Bible and I say, I believe that, but do I practice it? Do I live it? Or am I a hypocrite like the Pharisees? Just a thought. Let's move on. Verse 21. Then they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Oh, they're going to try flattery now. And I read that and I'm like, really? Really? You think this is going to work with Jesus? That you can flatter him and try and manipulate him? Well, they say, Teacher. I don't know. Are they pretending to be his disciples? I don't know. Teacher, we know that you teach rightly. Ortha, as in orthodox. You teach correctly. And you do not show personal favoritism. It doesn't matter who you're talking to. You always speak the truth. Whether you're talking to a rich person or a poor person, whether you're talking to an old person or a young person, doesn't matter. Nothing affects you. You do not compromise on anything. You're not influenced by status or anything like that. Whether you're talking to men or women, whatever, you always speak the truth. Wow. Funny thing is that that's all true. Jesus did always speak the truth. Jesus did not show personal favoritism, but they don't actually mean that. Even though what they're saying is actually true, they don't mean it. So after flattering him, here comes the question. And it is, I dare say, a brilliant question. This is probably the best question they could come up with. I can't think of anything harder for Jesus to answer. So this is the best they can do. So out of nowhere, and they're trying just to show that they're good, moral, religious people that have a theological problem, and we just need to, we need your help, Jesus. Verse 22. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, the Jews have been subjected to foreign rulers for the past 600 years. They were under the rule of the Babylonians, they were under the rule of the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. So this is not the first time they're subjected to a foreign nation, and never had a prophet suggested that, you know what, you don't need to pay your taxes, you don't need to pay tribute to the rulers. Never had the prophet said, don't do that. In fact, if you read in the book of Jeremiah, when the Babylonians are coming to conquer Israel, Jeremiah says to the people, submit to Babylon. Submit. God has put you in this situation. This is not an accident. Because of your sin, God is placing the Babylonians in authority over you. Therefore, submit to the Babylonians. This is God's will. So never did the prophets ever say, don't pay taxes to whatever nation you're subjected to. But what had happened was, a few decades before, actually probably around the time when Jesus was a boy, there was a guy whose name was Judas of Galilee. Not Judas Iscariot or anything like that. There's a lot of Judases in the Bible. There was a guy whose name was Judas of Galilee. And he basically taught that if you pay taxes to Rome, since God is our king, if you pay taxes to Rome, that is treason against God. Because you're supporting a pagan king instead of God, our king. And so he had a huge revolt to try and he tried to rebel against the Romans. And of course, it failed, and the Romans quickly killed him, squished that. Okay, but what happened was that these ideas of, you know what? This is God's land. And it was okay in the Old Testament when we would take the produce of the land and we would pay taxes for the good of the land, for the service of God in the temple. It was okay when we did that. But if this is the land of God, we shouldn't be giving our taxes to a pagan king. Surely not. And so a lot of people in Jesus' day had this thought. And so this is why this is such a brilliant question. Here are the two options. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? If Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, the Herodians are going to go straight to Pilate. That guy said don't pay taxes. Pilate will grab him, and he will have the same end as Judas of Galilee. End of discussion. Now, that's their hope. Their hope is that he'll say, yeah, don't pay the taxes, and they'll give him over to the government. That's their hope. But even if he doesn't say no, if he says, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, the crowd around him is going to get really disappointed. Jesus is going to seem very unpatriotic. Remember, this is the same crowd that just 2 days earlier was yelling for him, claiming that he was the Messiah, the son of David. They were cheering for him, Hosanna, the King of Israel. They're thinking that this is the Messiah who is going to, what? Save them from Rome. And so if Jesus says, pay your taxes to Rome, the people are going to say, wait a minute, how can this guy be the Messiah? If we want him to rescue us from Rome, but he's telling us to support Rome, he can't be the Messiah. So Jesus will lose all his following. So that's the idea. If he says yes, goes over to the governor and we kill him. I'm sorry, if he says don't pay the taxes, we hand him over to the governor. If he says yes, all the people will be against him. Ah, we got him. We got him. There's no way out of this. So, Jesus, of course, who is not fooled by them pretending to be righteous. Remember in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, it says Jesus knew what was in man. Jesus knew people's hearts. They didn't fool them for a second. So verse 23 says, but he perceived their craftiness and said to them, why do you test me? Luke says he perceived their craftiness. Mark said he perceived their hypocrisy. In Matthew it says he perceived their wickedness. So there's three descriptions of these people. They're crafty, they're hypocrites, and they're wicked. And he knows what they're up to. So Jesus says, show me the money. Verse 24. Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, Jesus' statement here is profound. Books have been written on this one verse. Volumes of books have been written on this one verse. And in fact, I am considering, I haven't decided, maybe next week we'll have a lesson seeing some implications of this as far as the relationship between the church and government and things like that. We'll see. I haven't decided yet for sure. We may be doing that next week. But okay, so they say, should we pay taxes? He says, show me the money. They show him the money. Who's that on there? They say it's Caesar. And he says, well, if it's Caesar's, I guess it belongs to him. Give it back to him. Simple as that. We all live under political governments. That's how it is. And we are obligated to follow the laws under which we live. That's how it is. In fact, the New Testament teaches us that we as Christians are supposed to be model citizens. I'm not going to take you to Romans 13. You can make a note, because if we get into Romans 13, then we're never going to get out of it. But let me read you one verse from Romans 13, where it talks about the relationship of the Christian towards the government. It says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities." You say, "Paul, why should I do that?" Because there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Now, that does not mean that every authority in the world is a good, godly Christian authority. It doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is that God is the one who raises up kings. God is the one who brings down kings. God is the one who can give you some authority, and God is the one who takes away your authority. The prime minister that we have right now in Greece could not rule for a second unless God allowed him to rule. And if God wanted to remove him, he could remove him in a second. God places people in authority according to his purposes. And so to say, "I will not submit," is to go against God, who has placed that authority in that position. And you will say, "Nico, no, I cannot submit to such a horrible, the leaders that we have are so horrible and evil, I cannot submit to them." Do you remember what the government was when Jesus spoke these words? Do you know who was the Caesar when Paul wrote Romans 13? When Paul wrote Romans 13 and he said, "Submit to the governing authorities," do you know who was Caesar, which Caesar was reigning in Rome? Nero. Nero, yes, the same Nero who killed his wife. The same Nero who killed his mother. The same Nero who arrested Christians and burnt them. He had them as light posts in his gardens at night when he burnt them. That's the Nero who was ruling when Paul wrote Romans 13. He wrote the book to the Romans, and he said, "Submit to the authorities." Because if God has put him there, it's for a reason. And remember, before you go around saying, "Well, I will not submit to those people because they're evil," let me remind you of something, that in the Old Testament, how often does God specifically place evil leaders as punishment over evil people? There are people who are evil, and so God, as a judgment upon them, gives them evil leaders. So before we go around saying, "Oh, we have an evil prime minister, oh, we have an evil president," maybe the problem is the nation itself, not that one guy. Now, back to what's going on here, but one last thing. In case you're saying, "Nico, are you saying that we should submit to the government no matter what, no questions asked?" Not necessarily. Let's clarify this really quick. There are times when a Christian is allowed to disobey an authority. In fact, I would say a Christian must disobey an authority if that authority is going against the greater authority, which is God. What do I mean by that? You have God, who is the greatest authority of all, and then there you have a bunch of other authorities, whether it's the governor, whether it's the king, whether it's police, whether it's teachers, whether it's parents of authority over the children. Okay? All these authorities are under the greatest authority, which is God. And so, for example, in Acts chapter 5, you have the authorities who arrest the apostles, and they say to them, "Don't preach the gospel." Now Jesus, ultimate authority, had said, "Preach the gospel." Now the governors say, "Don't preach the gospel." What do the apostles say? They say, "Sorry, we got to obey God rather than men." And Christians understood this in the first few centuries. Why is it that Rome killed so many Christians in the first 3 centuries? It's because the Christians said, we will be model citizens, we will obey the laws, we will pay the taxes, we will be as peaceful as we can, but we cannot sacrifice to the Roman gods. And Rome was saying, you have to sacrifice to Roman gods, and the Christians said, sorry, we can't do it, we have one Lord, and that would be idolatry. And so Rome killed them. My point is this. We could talk about the relationship between the state and church and the obligations that a Christian has towards the government, and we could have a long series and we could be here for months. Main point is this. It is our job as Christians to submit to the authorities that God has placed above us, unless those authorities try and get us to sin against God. Wherefore we would have to obey God rather than the authority. Back to Luke. And let's try and finish this off. Back to Luke chapter 20. Let's see what Jesus said. Because we always, when we read, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, we spend so much time on talking about the government that we miss the main point. The main point is not the beginning of Jesus' answer, it's the end of Jesus' answer, which is, render to God what is God's. Look, if you live in the Roman Empire, you've got to pay taxes to Rome. That's how it is. What you're going to do. If you didn't live in Rome, you don't have to pay taxes to Rome. But you always live in God's world. Always. And if we are to render to Caesar that which has Caesar's image on it, what is it that has God's image that we are to render to God? Genesis chapter 1. God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them in his own image. We are to give our lives to God. It is God who created us for his purposes, for himself. Yes, they're like, should we pay taxes? Yeah, of course you should pay taxes. But, most importantly, we're to give our lives to God. God is the one who gave us our lives. God is the one who created us. We did not create ourselves. And we are to give our lives to God in obedience and faith. So many people give their lives to so many things. They give their lives to their jobs. They give their lives to their hobbies. They give their lives to their stuff. They give their lives to their families. And these things are not necessarily bad on their own. But let me tell you something. Your job did not create you. Your hobbies did not create you. Your family did not create you. Stavroula and I did not create Elizabeth. God created Elizabeth. Stavroula and I could have tried all we wanted. If God said no, it wouldn't happen. God is the one who gives us our lives, our souls. The reason you are breathing right now, the reason you're not making your heartbeat. God is making your heartbeat. The reason your lungs are working is because God is giving you life. And we are to give our lives to him, honor him, glorify him, live for him. That is the big lesson of this passage. Not the taxes. He's like, yeah, pay your taxes. Give your lives to God. Remember Romans 12. This is one of my favorite passages. Give your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. Well, after such an answer, there's not much more to say. After such an amazing answer that Jesus gives, let's close with this verse, verse 26. But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people. And they, his enemies, they marveled at his answer and kept silent. Well, of course they did. What are they going to say after that? Thank you for your attention. Let's pray.